Good afternoon, Section Z. We did a lecture earlier on the Village of Euclid case, where the Supreme Court back in 1926, I think it was, determined that zoning ordinances in general are constitutional. That case has lent its name to the zoning process. You often hear references to Euclidean zoning, and so zoning processes that unfold in a manner like the zoning process that was reviewed in that case are referred to as Euclidean zoning. I also posted a link to a video on YouTube from the planning authorities in Fairfax County, Virginia. It was called Comprehensive Planning 101, but basically it was an introduction to the work that they are doing in Fairfax County, Virginia, creating land use plans for that county. Fairfax County is, if I remember correctly, I think this is one of the 10 wealthiest counties in the United States. It's a suburban county, so a lot of people who work in Washington, D.C. Will commute out to Fairfax County, where they'll have their home and then come in the mornings for work. But I thought it was an interesting and short introduction that showed you the process of comprehensive planning, the documents that they use in that process, and gave you a little introduction to some of the things that they are thinking through as they develop and apply their comprehensive plan in the zoning process. In this lecture, I wanted to focus a little bit more on the zoning process, on the development of comprehensive plans and their enforcement and the like. In the Euclid case, we saw a zoning ordinance that has been a model in some ways for many that came afterwards. And the process in general, I think, is fairly representative of what you see in zoning occurring later in various parts of the United States. And those zoning processes, as you can see from the case, have often reflected or are based upon certain assumptions. Some of them are necessary to the zoning process. Some may just be assumptions that are held by certain zoning planners, but not by others. But in the case, I think you saw an assumption that separation of land uses is a good thing, that it's good to have different parts of the city where you do different kinds of things with the land. You have industrial uses in one place, you have residential uses in a different place, you have commercial uses in another place, on the theory that land uses kind of can harm or interfere with each other, and so it's good to spread them out. I think probably that is an assumption that is being questioned and rethought in many zoning processes now. You may have noted in the Fairfax County video that there was some emphasis on mixed use areas. And so it's now much more common to have city zoning plans that will contemplate trying to put residential areas and commercial areas in the same location, so that somebody can walk to many of the places they want to go. They can have a home, they can walk to the grocery store, they can walk to entertainment and recreation facilities, they can maybe even walk to work or get there easily through public transit. And so I think there's some rethinking going on the whole idea that we need to widely separate different uses of land. I think zoning involves an assumption that central planning of land use patterns is efficient, or that it's necessary, or in any event that it will work better than just leaving decision making up to an unrestricted marketplace. That you get better decisions or better patterns of land use if there is some direction coming from a central authority that is kind of pointing people to different locations depending on the kinds of use that they want to make of property. I think in the case and often in zoning processes, you find an assumption that it's important to protect single-family housing. That the most highly protected areas in the Euclid Ordinance were the areas where single-family dwellings were located. Lots of other kinds of use were kept out of those areas on the theory that you wanted to create this kind of secluded haven. And so, kind of a preference for, the suburban lifestyle seems to be reflected in that case and in many other zoning ordinances. Kind of an assumption maybe that open spaces are important, that you want to have minimum lot size restrictions with setbacks and side yards and room between buildings. You want to kind of keep light and air able to flow, at least in certain parts of the city. That's a kind of a healthier way for people to live. But some of the assumptions underlying the Village of Euclid case probably are being called into question. Zoning, the way it's been practiced in this country, is probably one of the reasons why so many people have to commute to work. That we developed all these residential neighborhoods and separated them from the places where people work. And so you have to have a car if you're not in an area with public transit. And I think there's some rethinking of that set of assumptions going on these days. You may also have picked up in the Village of Euclid case that zoning sometimes can be a way of enforcing some class biases. You remember in the excerpt from the district court case in Village of Euclid, they quote it back on page 572. The district court, in striking down the Euclid Ordinance, said that in the last analysis, the result to be accomplished is to classify people, or classify them according to their income or situation in life. And so the district court thought very much what was going on is you were trying to kind of keep certain classes of people separate by the way you located different kinds of living spaces. And maybe you saw a little echo of that in the opinion where the court is talking about apartment houses and saying that, really if you put an apartment house in a residential area, that's kind of a parasite. It comes pretty close to being a nuisance. Maybe there's some class bias reflected in that kind of language. So zoning authorities adopt zoning ordinances, and then they are responsible for enforcing them. So how does that enforcement process work? Well, if you want to engage in certain activities of land use, so you want to, say, build a building or move into a building or remodel significantly an existing structure, you may well have to get permits for those sorts of things. You may have to get a building permit if you want to put up a new building. You might have to get a certificate of occupancy if you want to move into a building that has been remodeled or has been constructed. And so the way that zoning ordinances are often enforced is through the denial of permits or the limitation of issuance of permits to make sure people conform to the zoning ordinances that are in place. On page 579 in the book, the authors talk about zoning legislation, and they talk about a standard state zoning enabling act that has been fairly influential, but that act called for the creation of two different regulatory bodies. One was a zoning commission and the other was a board of adjustment. The zoning commission was there to make kind of broader policy decisions about how land use patterns should be directed and what the contents of zoning regulation should be, whereas the board of adjustment was adjudicating more particular cases about application of those regulations. And so we'll see later on a discussion of these instruments called special exceptions or variances. You can go to a board of adjustment and seek a variance from the zoning ordinance. And so they make those more case-by-case kinds of decisions. One common requirement in zoning laws is that zoning regulations have to be made in accordance with a comprehensive plan. And so the idea is that the legislators want to encourage a planning process. They don't want zoning decisions to kind of be ad hoc and one-off. They want there to be an overall vision about what would be a desirable pattern of development in a particular jurisdiction. But I think, as you see in the book, that comprehensive plan doesn't necessarily have to kind of be written out as a single plan that is adopted and voted on. It can just be the amalgam of a number of different documents. I think you saw that reflected in the Fairfax County video that I had you watch. Their comprehensive plan consisted of a wide number of different things, including maps and other things that they had adopted. So I wanted to think a little bit about this process of land use planning. I wanted to try and imagine ourselves in the position of city planners, central planners, and we're in the process of kind of revising and updating a zoning ordinance for a city. And so we're trying to think into the future. One of the difficult things about this process is that you have to try to think down the road and imagine what will be desirable land use patterns, what will be land use patterns that people will put up with 30 years from now, 50 years from now, et cetera. And so I'm going to include a link for a discussion list in which I'd like to get you thinking about that question. And head over there after I get it set up, and post some thoughts about what you think land use patterns are going to be like in 2070, 50 years from now. What is it going to be like to live in the United States? How are people going to want to live? What's going to be the relationship between home and work and shopping and that sort of thing? What do you expect to be different 50 years from now than what we assume or experience today? And this, I think, is a really difficult exercise, in part because the rate of technological change and other things going on in our world, I think may have unpredictable effects on future land use patterns. I think about the rate of technological change and think about something that 20 years ago seemed like kind of cutting edge. I don't know if any of you have ever seen a Blockbuster video store or remember them. But 20 years ago, Blockbuster seemed to many of us like kind of the cutting edge of technology. We were used to entertainment patterns where if a movie came out, you could see it while it was in the theaters, and so it'd be there for a few weeks or months, and then it would disappear, and then you had to wait until some kind of TV network decided to pay to show that movie on TV, and then you could see it when it was there. And Blockbuster seemed to be this kind of game changer, taking advantage of VCR technology. Now you could go to a store and you could rent a movie that you wanted to see. You didn't have to wait for it to be shown somewhere that was accessible to you. You could make the decision, I want to see this movie, and take it home, put it in your VCR and watch it. And that seemed to be really like the wave of the future. But here we are 20 years later, and Blockbuster's gone out of business and the stores are all gone because the rate of technological change kind of superseded that technology very quickly. Now with Netflix and video streaming and Amazon Prime, and Blockbuster just couldn't survive. And so what kind of technological changes might occur that are going to change our land use patterns in the future. In the old version of this textbook, the authors say the most important technological invention of the 1990s was the home computer, together with development of the internet. What effect is this likely to have upon land use patterns? And so just think back, what has changed about the way we do our daily activities as a result of the internet. It's really interesting to me that I can be sitting here in my house and teaching my class. I don't actually have to get in my car and drive down to the law school and you all show up, that it's possible for me to give you a lecture on property law when we aren't in the same location. What are other things that are going to affect the way that people make decisions about land use? You see a lot of emphasis these days on concerns about climate change and people wanting to develop sustainable patterns of living. You see, tiny houses, people, wanting to build smaller houses to live in because they think it will be better environmentally. I recently heard a report, I think it was on NPR, about the first occasion in which somebody had actually stolen a tiny house. That somebody had a house that was on it was on rollers, I guess, on a particular lot, and their whole house had been stolen, which didn't seem to be possible, 30 years ago. But if you have tiny houses and they're on wheels, then maybe it is something that you have to worry about that you didn't used to have to worry about. Are there changes in family life? Are people having smaller families now than they did 50 years ago? Does that mean you need more individual living accommodations than you used to need? Or how will that change in the next 50 years? What about this pandemic that we're going through now? Is this going to change what people think about the way they want to set up their lives? Is it going to increase the amount of telecommuting that goes on? Are people going to suddenly realize that Zoom actually works and I don't have to kind of travel as much as I did? I don't even have to go into the office as much as I did. And will more people be working from home in the future? Is this going to change our shopping patterns? Think about how there used to be lots and lots of large malls, and some of those are kind of emptying out because people don't shop the same way they used to. It's much easier to just go online and order the things that you need and have them delivered, and so you can do your holiday shopping without actually getting in a car and driving somewhere. So those are just some representative examples of ways that land use patterns have changed, about things that have already changed the way that we use land. And I want you to put yourself in the position of a city planner who's trying to develop comprehensive plan or update a comprehensive plan for an urban area for the next 30 years or 50 years. And so you're trying to imagine in 2070, how are we going to be living? How will it be different from now? And what kinds of zoning changes should we be making in our comprehensive plan in order to anticipate those future land use needs? So I'm going to stop now and go set that up over that discussion list, and take some time to think about that, and then go post your predictions there. And I don't know if this ELC webpage will still be available in 50 years, but if we get to 2070 and you guys remember having predicted something that turned out to be the case, and we can still locate that archive, and I'm still around to help do that. I don't know if I will be or not, but it will be fun to see who actually did the best job of figuring out where we were going to be in 2070.